Hello, Potomac Crossing Ward. This is 2020 Book of Mormon. Come follow me. Lesson 48. Moroni 7 through 9. So I'm going to do the same thing as usual. General comments on the chapters. So, general comments on Moroni 7 through 9. In the mouth of two or three witnesses shall every word be established. That's set up in Deuteronomy 19:15, and it follows through all of the scriptures. These three chapters form the final three arguments against the Nephites, each worse than the last, explaining why the Nephites were annihilated. These three chapters are not Moroni remembering his father as he wanders alone. Each chapter is increasingly negative and traces the downfall of the Nephites. The first chapter, chapter 7, is an essay on faith, but shows the Nephite church was having difficulty with the basics. The second chapter, chapter 8, shows the Nephite church has become mired in contention over matters that revealed they were more interested in faulting the genuinely innocent than in detecting their own flaws and repenting of them. The final chapter, chapter 9, documents Nephite depravity and explains what a society has to do to be wiped off the face of the earth: murder, rape, and cannibalism. Despite the horrors they're witnessing firsthand, Mormon counsels Moroni to be diligent so he can save himself. We see that in chapter 9, verse 6. Taken in a more generalized way, this is the cycle of apostasy distilled. Simple doctrinal and behavioral problems, then contention over egregiously bad doctrine, and then self-destructive behavior. Things get worse as people rebel, they refuse to repent, and they just deteriorate. And we see that through the entire Book of Mormon. In all three cases, Moroni uses the writings of his father to condemn the Nephites as opposed to writing the arguments himself. Mormon witnessed and documented these things as a preeminent leader in the church and in the military. Moroni deferred to his father in condemning the Nephites owing to the position of authority and his more extensive experience. An implicit statement in the narrative, which started all the way back in 1 Nephi, in 1 Nephi 12:12, and was again echoed in 3 Nephi, we see that in 3 Nephi 27:32 by the Lord himself, is the effect of deliberate rebellion after such exceptional righteousness. After the wicked were destroyed in the New World after Jesus' crucifixion, the more righteous remnant were spared and converted, and enjoyed nearly 200 years of Zion-like existence. But when they slide into apostasy afterwards, the fall is so hard it ends up resulting in their extinction. The Lord created an exceedingly righteous remnant that prospered for a time, but he also foresaw their rebellion and collapse would be as exceedingly bad. This suggests from a sociological point of view that societies have a kind of proportionate rebound effect when it comes to being aggressively managed by the Lord. The Lord chose to purge the wicked to create an exceptionally righteous society, but he knew the effect of doing it would be a society that collapses in extreme rebellion. Now, in the Book of Mormon, we see this theme pop up right at the very beginning in 1 Nephi 12:12. Nephi picks it up again in 2 Nephi 26:9, but then it also gets repeated by Alma the Younger in Alma 45:10 through 14 when he is talking to his sons, and then Samuel the Lamanite repeats it again in Helaman 13:5 through 10. And then, as mentioned earlier, the resurrected Christ himself, when he appears to the Nephites, brings this up in 3 Nephi 27:32. So this is something that's portrayed as inevitable through the entire Book of Mormon, from the very beginning all the way through the end. So what's happening here is Moroni is setting up the arguments or the evidence or the witness, like the three witnesses, that show why the Nephites were destroyed. He presents these three writings, one, the lecture on faith in chapter 7, 2, the infant baptism issue in chapter 8, and then 3, the chapter 9 version of or recounting of the depravity of the Nephites as the evidence against the Nephites, why they were annihilated. Okay, so that's the general comments on 7 through 9. So general comments on chapter 7. Moroni quotes one of his father's discourses on faith, hope, and charity. This discourse by Mormon is rather complex and has more to do with the practical applications of faith, hope, and charity than any doctrinal or theological treatment of those subjects. Mormon's discourse teaches how to discern who and what is good and evil in verses 2 through 19, how to find and embrace those good things which God has revealed in verses 20 through 39, and where these good things ought to lead somebody in verses 40 through 48. Throughout the discourse, Mormon admits he's preaching at the choir, which we see in verses 3 through 5 and again in 39, and yet he continues to exhort them to lay hold upon every good thing, which we see in verse 9, and towards the pure love of Christ, in verse 47, informing them it is something that they have as yet not achieved, in verse 48. This kind of exhortation is probably what Mormon is referring to in chapter 9, verse 4. The people tremble in anger when reprimanded outright, so Mormon has to put it to them gently when he encourages them to repent. Otherwise, his message is lost in hostility and contention. The Nephite church is having difficulty keeping a Christian walk, so Mormon is trying to gently steer them in the right direction. I mean, when the contents of chapter 7 represent a powerful theological treatise being presented to the church, it's clear that the church is having serious problems. I mean, these are basic, very basic nuts and bolts doctrine where Mormon is saying, here's how you discern between good and evil. And here's why you should discern between good and evil. And if you do good, this should be the result. So these are very basic things. And if Mormon is having to coach the Nephite church at this point with very basic things, this is telling you how bad the Nephite church is, how difficult the circumstances are. Okay, and then so comments on Moroni chapter 8. This chapter is a blistering attack on people among the Nephites who believe infants need to be baptized or they'll be damned if they die before they can choose to be baptized. Mormon rejects this as dead works in verse 23 and says it is the people who believe this who need to repent and be as little children, verse 10, or they will be sent to hell, verse 21. The fundamental argument addressed in these chapters is that of adults saying infants are sinful, so that adults are taking the focus off themselves and putting it onto infants. Mormon takes it off the infants and puts it back onto the adults who are promoting this false doctrine. The origin of the doctrine would be infant mortality and the fear of religious parents over the eternal state of those children. But adults who respond with the solution of infant baptism are focusing on the wrong thing, making an innocent baby at fault when it is they themselves who are at fault. While the intrinsically sinful nature is inherited by all mortals when we are born into a fallen world, we are only judged for our own sins. Infants are therefore sinless and have no need for baptism. The unstated implications in Mormon's argument are that there was no infant baptism under the law of Moses, referenced in verse 8, and Jesus didn't institute it himself in verses 11 to 13. So the only reason the Nephites would now start such a practice is to fault the innocent in an effort to excuse themselves. In verse 5, such doctrine shows these people have strayed far away from what Jesus himself taught, which we see in verse 8. Now, some readers take this chapter as an overt indictment of the practice of the Roman Catholic Church of baptizing infants. While it can be read as such by implication, it is clear Mormon is commenting on a Nephite practice, not a last days Gentile practice. Various Book of Mormon authors directly address the apostasy of the church in general among Gentiles, and this is not what Mormon is doing in the present text. Taking it as a broadside against the Roman Catholic Church in specific is acontextual. Mormon is clearly not addressing the Roman Catholic Church. He is clearly addressing the Nephites. Is the doctrine, is the premise, the theology portable, and can we apply it in other cases? Of course we can, but that's not what Mormon is addressing. Mormon is talking about problems inside the Nephite church, and he's saying, look, this is a church that relatively recently, right? We're talking like 200 years. Well, now we're down to 400 years, okay, but so relatively recently, the resurrected Christ appeared to them himself and taught these people. And when you go this far off the line, and you go after having so much light and wisdom and all this, and then you go this far off, you're really totally missing it. And that's Mormon's point. Mormon's point is, you guys have completely gone off the rails. And this is just more evidence of their general rejection of Christ's teachings. And then chapter 9 is just this kind of depressing final indictment, where Mormon lays it all out. And it's like, here's why the Nephites have to be destroyed, because they are so awful, so wicked, and their behavior is so evil. It exceeds the Lamanites by far, and they have to be destroyed because they just simply won't repent. Now, inside chapter 9 are these admonitions of Mormon to Moroni. He says, Mormon is speaking to Moroni, and he says, we need to stay good. We need to do the right thing so that we can land ourselves on the right hand of God at the last day. So he's saying, Mormon is giving Moroni some fatherly advice, and he's saying, look, things are bad. I know things are bad. Things are really bad. But you and I, and whoever else will listen to us, needs to keep righteous. We need to keep the commandments. We need to do what we know is right. Because at the end of the day, we are responsible for ourselves, and we have to land ourselves at the right hand of God at the day of judgment. So even though things are terrible around us, we need to focus on this long-term, eternal goal, of what's going on. So this becomes kind of, as I read it, it becomes kind of a recipe. As things around you are deteriorating, you don't let yourself get caught up in it and weighed down and just overwhelmed by how bad things are. You have to remove yourself from the present difficulties of the situation that you're in, and focus on this long-term, this eternal goal of what it is you're going to accomplish. Now, in Moroni's case, obviously, Moroni outlived all of the rest of the Nephites, or most of the rest of the Nephites, and then he had to wander for 20 years, carrying these records around, the records of his father, so that he could get them to the safe place where they would be deposited then, for hundreds, thousands of years, until they came into the hands of the Gentiles, right, through Joseph Smith. So Moroni has to get over all of this horrific stuff that he's seen, and he does that by focusing on the eternal. And I think that's a recipe for us. When we're in difficult circumstances, difficult situations, we need to focus on the eternal situation, and we need to recognize that even if the people all around us are going bad, that we have a responsibility to ourselves, that as bad things happen, we can't let ourselves become bad as well. We can't just give up and go with the flow, so to speak. So we need to keep ourselves good, and we need to do the right thing, what we know is right. And then next week we'll talk about, or the next video we'll talk about Moroni chapter 10, Moroni's farewell His closing admonition to the Lamanites.